Hello class, and welcome to our sheep brain dissection. Now before we get into all the fun, let's handle some safety aspects. Some of the first things you're going to need are going to be gloves, goggles, apron, and make sure you have closed-toed shoes. After the safety equipment, you're also going to need some dissection equipment. You're going to need a pair of scissors and a scalpel. Let's start by looking at our brain now. We're going to start with the superior aspect. Now we're staring at the superior view. So this is our anterior. Here's our posterior where the spinal cord is. And we can see this light whitish coating on top. That is the meninges, our connective tissue covering, protecting the brain. And if we get our forceps here, we can even see how if you find a tear, how we can separate easily the meninges from the underlying brain. Actually, that space we were in right there, that was our subarachnoid space. So running right down the middle in the longitudinal fissure, we can see how the meninges dips down into there. And that is the falx cerebri, that infolding of meninges. We can see another portion of our brain, the cerebellum, this rounded area here on the posterior. So you have cerebrum, cerebellum. Between the two, we have the transverse fissure. We see a second infolding of meninges there. So you have our longitudinal fissure, transverse fissure. On an inferior of the brain, we can see some other parts. Here's the pituitary gland right here. It's a little redder. So that's our pituitary. See the optic nerve branching off. Those would go to the eye. Between the two where they connect, that's the optic chiasm. At the anterior of the brain, it's a little lighter, we see the olfactory bulb. And that would be right above the nose. Here, we can see portion of the brain stem at the bottom. So we're going to go ahead and turn this over, and we're going to start to remove the meninges. It's important to leave this area here intact. We don't want to rip off that pituitary gland. So we're going to sort of cut into our meninges here. It's a little tough. And we're going to start to cut around this area here where the pituitary gland is. Remember, you don't want to be ripping things off. You'll easily be able to start to pull back the meninges. So be careful in taking it off. Take your time. It's okay. I'm going to cut along the transverse fissure here. Notice it pulls easily out of that longitudinal fissure. And now we've exposed the surface of the brain. But remember, what we're tearing through, what we're taking off, is the dura mater and the arachnoid mater. Stuck to it right now, you see a sheen, that's the pia mater. Now, in order to completely remove the meninges, you have to get in here into that transverse fissure and cut that infolding of meninges there, the tentorium cerebelli. Then we're going to cut it off, but remember, we're going to leave that pituitary gland on there. So what I want you to do is take that meninges. You can see it's come off very easily. The surface we're looking at now is a dermator, and look how strong it is. You can just give it a big old tug, and it's going to be really, really hard to tear. That's because of how strong the dermator is. So here's our dermator. If I flip it over, the other side, that would be the arachnoid mater in there. Let's go ahead and set that aside. Now we have our brain, and the surface you can still see a nice sheen, and that's the pia mater. You see the cerebrum with all of its grooves, all those, the gyrus, the bump, and the sulcus, the little indentations. We see that longitudinal fissure. There we go, our longitudinal fissure. Transverse fissure, cerebellum. And if we separate the two cerebral hemispheres, we can see all the way down inside and connecting the two sides. Let me point it out to you here. There you go. There is the corpus callosum. Notice I didn't have to cut to separate the two cerebral hemispheres. They're joined by that tract, that corpus callosum. Now I'd like you to go ahead and pull the cerebellum back gently. Go ahead, put your fingers in there. And you can see part of the midbrain in there. And if you look real closely, way back in there, you can actually see part of the pineal gland. If we flip it over, we can still see once again our pituitary, olfactory bulb, and optic nerve, and the optic chiasm between. And here's our brain stem. Okay, here's the fun part. Grab the scalpel, and now we're going to split the two hemispheres in half. Just go right down the middle, a nice smooth cut, including cutting the cerebellum in half. Cut it right down the middle there with the cerebellum, all the way through, and now you've separated the brain into two halves. So we've got our right and our left hemispheres all the way split in half. This is going to enable us to find all the parts on our longitudinal view. Let's take a look at the parts we can see in our longitudinal view. We have our anterior and posterior and superior views. Here at the anterior we have our frontal lobe. The posterior we're going to have our occipital lobe. And the superior we're going to have our parietal lobe. We can also see the major tract connecting the two cerebral hemispheres, the corpus callosum. That's this white band here. We can see some of the other major parts of the brain as well, such as the diencephalon, the brain stem, and the cerebellum, as well as components like the pituitary gland and the optic chiasm. We can find a few other parts here as well, such as the thalamus, which is this oval almond-shaped structure here. We can also find the hypothalamus below the thalamus, and that's going to be between the thalamus and the optic chiasm. We can see the epithalamus above the thalamus. Mostly what we see here is the pineal gland located right here. We can also see portions of the midbrain pons, and medulla oblongata. Here is our lateral ventricle. We can also see the third ventricle here sitting on top of the thalamus. If we follow that down through the cerebral aqueduct here, you can see it joining up with the fourth ventricle right here between the cerebellum and the medulla oblongata. If we put our two halves back together again and gently pull back the cerebellum, we are now able to see the tectum of the midbrain. The tectum includes the two bumps on top and the two bumps on bottom. The two on top there are your superior colliculi. The two on the bottom are your inferior colliculi. And if you look closely right here, we can see that pineal gland sticking out.